University and a professor of law and philosophy at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And Professor, thank you so much for your time today. We appreciate your analysis. I wanted to just begin by understanding your position on the war now. Like many others, you initially supported the war on the argument of deterrence. You now say Israel's war should not be supported and cannot be justified. What was the line crossed, and can you explain your reasoning now?
Yeah, well, my initial support was based partly on deterrence and partly on other considerations. The war business is very cruel, and the price is always paid with blood, and often with blood of innocents. The case we're talking about now is, of course, especially harsh in this way. That was always true. That was true on the morning of October 7th, following the horrendous crimes by Hamas, which initiated this round. But it's always important to try and, to the extent possible, try and think about this kind of balance of weighty considerations. How much price is being paid in the blood of innocents compared to how much important value is achieved, partly as a way of, as you mentioned, deterring further assaults, and assaults which will also result in, of course, many deaths and suffering of innocents. Initially, I thought that Israel had no choice but to respond very forcefully, indeed ruthlessly, despite the price in the suffering and death of many, many innocents. It's very hard to think that what we're seeing now on the ground, which is already, by the way, much less intense fighting, it's very hard to think of this as something that has anything resembling the kind of value that the initial Israeli attacks had. And to the extent that I understand what's going on or about to go on in Rafah, it's especially true of that. Perhaps this is why the American administration position is so clear on that.
Indeed, and becoming clearer now, David, as well. You've seen what Israel has done in Gaza, the extraordinary death toll on the ground there, the slow walking of aid, and what the UN now calls a man-made famine. It's been put to me in recent weeks that this is no longer being framed as a war against Hamas. Rather, this is a war against Palestinians. How do you respond to that?
Well, I'm not a spokesperson for Israel, obviously. There is a war against Hamas. Hamas is not the usual kind of either government or military force. It is embedded in the civilian population. It takes advantage of being embedded within the civilian population. And so even the most good faith kind of military effort against it is bound to result in horrible harm to innocents. That's just a fact, given what's going on the ground. We should also mention other relevant facts, like, for instance, the sheer density of the population in Gaza. On the other hand, I do think that Israel has not been doing everything it should have been doing, for instance, when it comes to humanitarian aid, securing humanitarian aid. And we also have some reports that at least sometimes Israel has been, at the very least, too tolerant when it comes to collateral damage.
I wanted to ask you about the position of Prime Minister Netanyahu as well. He says Israel has no way of defeating Hamas without entering Rafah. And as you've heard, he has threatened to do that with or without the support of the United States. So what is your understanding of what could potentially happen next here? And would you argue that his political survival depends on him actually going ahead with this now?
So I'd be speculating here. Of course, I'm not privy to any inside information here. The first thing to note is that Prime Minister Netanyahu is almost certainly bluffing or lying when he says that Israel can do this alone. Israel has been relying on mostly American, not only, but mostly American support, even just for the supply of ammunition, almost from day one. So this is just false. It's a part of a bluff, it seems to me. When Prime Minister Netanyahu says that Israel cannot defeat Hamas without going into Rafah, he's probably right, but in a really uninteresting way. He's probably right because Israel cannot eliminate Hamas. This is not a realistic aim for the war. What Israel can perhaps do is what Israel has indeed done is seriously weaken Hamas, weaken its ability to control both politically and militarily the territory within Gaza. And I want to say that Rafah has some perfectly legitimate targets there. Israel has to deal with longer term considerations. Israel has to do what it can to free the hostages, obviously. So it's not as if all of this is for nothing. The question is just how much by way of achievements Israel is likely to achieve and what the price will be, both to its own forces, obviously, to the hostages, but also to innocents in Gaza.